Paris, June 1984. In a hospital room overlooking the city, a man lies dying of a disease that has no name in polite society. His head is shaved, his body is wasting away, but his eyes remain sharp, watchful, taking in everything, even now. Michel Foucault has spent his life examining how power moves through bodies, how knowledge shapes what we call truth, how we became the subjects we think we are. Now his own body is failing, and he is observing its dissolution with the same relentless curiosity he brought to everything else. On the bedside table sits a manuscript, the final volume of his History of Sexuality, unfinished. He had wanted to trace how human beings turned themselves into subjects through practices of confession, self-examination, and desire. He had wanted to show that even our most intimate experiences were shaped by forces larger than ourselves. But time has run out, and the work will remain incomplete, like so many lives cut short by a plague that power refused to acknowledge until it was too late. Tonight, we follow the journey of a philosopher who showed us that the things we take for granted, madness, crime, sexuality, even truth itself, are not natural categories, but historical inventions. A man who lived between shadows and light, who found freedom in the most unexpected places, who died young but left behind a way of seeing that changed everything. If these evening explorations help you find rest, consider staying with us. A gentle like helps other wandering minds discover these stories, and subscribing means we can continue this work together, night after night. Let us know in the comments whose life you'd like us to illuminate next. For now, settle into comfort. Let the day's tensions dissolve. We are going to walk through Foucault's world slowly, carefully, letting his questions become our own as we drift toward sleep.
The house in Poitiers stood on Rue Arthur Ronc, solid and respectable, with shutters painted a proper shade of gray. Inside, everything was arranged according to rules that no one had to speak aloud because everyone simply knew them. Meals at precise hours, conversation conducted in measured tones, the expectation that children would be seen when required and invisible otherwise. This was the world into which Paul Michel Foucault was born on October 15, 1926, the second child of a surgeon who believed that life, like the body, could be controlled through correct technique. His father, Paul Foucault, was a man of absolute certainties. He performed operations with the confidence of someone who trusted his hands and his knowledge completely. At home, he expected the same precision he demanded in the operating theater. He had planned his children's lives the way he planned his surgeries, every step mapped out in advance. His son would follow him into medicine. This was not a suggestion, it was a fact, as inevitable as anatomy. Young Michel, as the family called him, understood early that he was expected to become someone he was not. The realization came gradually, not as a single moment, but as an accumulation of small recognitions. The way his father looked at him with something close to disappointment even when he had done nothing wrong. The way his mother, Anne, maintained her distance, as if affection required energy she preferred to conserve. The way his older brother seemed to navigate the household's invisible rules, while Michel kept stumbling over boundaries he could not see. He was brilliant, everyone agreed on that. His teachers at the lycée marveled at his memory, his ability to absorb and synthesize information, his precociousness. He read voraciously, escaping into books the way other children escaped into play. Philosophy, history, literature, he consumed them all with a hunger that had nothing to do with school assignments and everything to do with searching for something he could not name.
But brilliance was not the same as happiness. Michel moved through his childhood with a sense of fundamental wrongness, as if he were performing a role in a play where everyone else had been given the script except him. He watched other boys, studying how they carried themselves, how they talked about girls, how they formed friendships that seemed effortless and natural. He mimicked these behaviors, learning to pass, but the performance exhausted him. Poitiers itself felt like a trap, a provincial city where everyone knew everyone, where reputation mattered more than truth, where deviation from norms was noticed and punished through gossip and exclusion. The city had medieval roots, narrow streets that wound between ancient buildings, and that history felt oppressive to Michel rather than romantic. These stones had witnessed centuries of conformity, of people living the same prescribed lives generation after generation. The war came when Michel was 13. France fell to Germany with a speed that shocked everyone who had believed in French invincibility. Poitiers found itself in the occupied zone, German soldiers in the streets, new rules and new dangers. The Foucault family, solidly bourgeois and carefully apolitical, adapted. Paul Foucault continued his surgical practice, the household routines continued. But for Michel, something about the occupation crystallized a feeling he had carried for years, the sense that power was everywhere, invisible but absolute, shaping what people could say and do and even think. He noticed how people changed under occupation. Neighbors who had been friendly became informers. Others who had seemed conventional found unexpected courage. The categories that had seemed so stable, good and bad, normal and deviant, French and foreign, suddenly became fluid, revealed as constructs rather than natural facts. Michel watched all of this with the careful attention he brought to everything, filing observations away in a mind that was already learning to see power as a relation rather than a thing, as something that flowed through everyday interactions rather than simply emanating from the occupier's guns.
But his most pressing problem was private, a secret that grew heavier as he moved into adolescence. He was attracted to boys, not to girls, despite all his efforts to make himself feel what he was supposed to feel. He lay in bed at night, aware that the desire moving through his body had no acceptable outlet, no future, no name except the clinical and damning ones he had encountered in books. Homosexuality, inversion, perversion, words that turned him into a case study, a pathology, a problem to be solved. In 1940s France, this was not merely forbidden. It was pathologized by medicine, criminalized by law, condemned by the church, erased from polite conversation. There were no visible gay communities, no language of pride, no possibility of living openly. There were only shadows, dangerous encounters in public toilets, the constant terror of exposure. Michel understood that his desire made him sick in the eyes of everyone who mattered: his father, the doctor, his teachers, the entire respectable world of Poitiers. The knowledge nearly killed him. At 15, he attempted suicide for the first time. The method was not particularly effective, more a cry of desperation than a serious attempt, but the despair behind it was utterly real. He felt trapped in a body that wanted the wrong things, in a life that had no space for who he actually was. His parents responded by sending him to see a psychiatrist, a well-meaning man who explained that Michel's urges were a developmental phase that could be corrected with proper guidance. The sessions were humiliating. Michel sat in the psychiatrist's office, a room that smelled of leather and old books, and listened to explanations of his own abnormality. The doctor spoke of arrested development, of fixation at an immature stage, of the need to redirect his libido toward appropriate objects. Michel nodded and said what was expected, learning early the art of telling authority figures what they wanted to hear while keeping his actual thoughts carefully hidden. But something else was happening during those sessions. As Michel listened to the psychiatric discourse about homosexuality, a part of his mind stepped back and observed the discourse itself. How did these categories get created? Who decided what counted as normal sexual development? What power did this doctor have to define Michel's innermost experiences as sickness? The questions were forming, though he did not yet have the tools to articulate them fully. School became his refuge and his torment. He excelled academically, finding in intellectual achievement a kind of validation that was missing everywhere else. His teachers at the Lycée Henri IV, where he prepared for university entrance exams, recognized his exceptional abilities. He was preparing for the concours, the brutally competitive examinations that determined entry to France's elite Grandes Écoles. Michel threw himself into preparation with an intensity that worried even his demanding father. He studied philosophy with a teacher named Louis Girard, a man who introduced him to thinkers who would reshape his understanding of everything. Hegel's dialectic showed Michel that truth was not static, but emerged through conflict and contradiction. Nietzsche's genealogical method demonstrated that moral categories had histories, that what seemed natural and eternal was actually contingent and constructed. These ideas were intoxicating, dangerous, liberating. They suggested that the world that was crushing him was not inevitable. In 1946, at 20, Michel took the entrance examination for the École Normale Supérieure, the most prestigious institution for training French intellectuals. It was brutally difficult, requiring years of preparation, testing candidates across multiple disciplines. When the results were posted, Michel's name was not on the list. He had failed. The humiliation was crushing. Everything he had worked for, the one path that seemed to offer escape from Poitiers and his father's expectations, was closed.
He spent a year in a kind of internal exile, retaking classes, preparing to try again. His father's disappointment hung over the household like fog. Michel withdrew further into himself, reading, thinking, living almost entirely in his head. He discovered the phenomenologists, Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, philosophers who examined how consciousness constructed its world. He read psychology, particularly the work on perception and abnormality. Every book was a piece in a puzzle he was trying to solve. How do we become who we are? How much of what we take as given is actually imposed? The following year, 1947, he tried again. This time, his name appeared on the list. He had passed, ranked 4th. He would go to Paris, to the École Normale Supérieure, to the institution that had produced Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, Lévi-Strauss and Merleau-Ponty. He would escape Poitiers and everything it represented. The relief was physical, like breathing after being underwater too long. But Paris brought new torments alongside new freedoms. The École Normale Supérieure, known as the ENS or simply Normale, was housed in an old building on Rue d'Ulm in the Latin Quarter. Students lived in small rooms along corridors, sharing bathrooms and dining halls, living in close proximity that made privacy almost impossible. Michel was assigned a room on the 3rd floor, barely large enough for a bed and a desk, with a window that looked onto an interior courtyard where sound echoed and carried. The atmosphere was intensely competitive. These were the elite of the elite, brilliant young people who had survived the most rigorous selection process in France. They argued about Marxism and existentialism late into the night, performed in amateur theater productions, formed political factions and romantic alliances. Michel watched it all with his characteristic detachment, participating intellectually, but holding something essential back. Because here, too, he had to hide, perhaps even more carefully than in Poitiers, because here the stakes were higher. These were the people who would become France's intellectual elite, and reputation formed at the ENS could follow you for life. Michel met other gay students. There was a whole clandestine network, but they operated in absolute secrecy, coded language, careful glances, assignations arranged with the precision of espionage. The culture at Normale was aggressively masculine, with a particular cult of virility around the communist students who dominated politically. They talked about the working class and revolution while maintaining the most conventional attitudes about sexuality. To be homosexual was to be bourgeois, decadent, counter-revolutionary. Michel, who was drawn to Marxism intellectually, found himself excluded from the communist circles because of who he was, or more precisely because of the constant effort to hide who he was.
The hiding took its toll. In his second year at Normal, Michel attempted suicide again, this time more seriously. He slashed at his chest with a razor, not deeply enough to die, but deeply enough to leave scars he would carry the rest of his life. A friend found him and got help. He was hospitalized briefly, then released back to the school with a note in his file: "Unstable, requires monitoring."
To the school with a note in his file: "Unstable, requires monitoring." The school authorities, unsure how to handle a suicidal student, assigned someone to check on him nightly. This surveillance, intended as care, felt like another form of imprisonment. Michel was now officially marked as abnormal, someone who needed watching. The irony would not be lost on him later when he wrote about how institutions manage deviance through observation and normalization. But at 21, he simply felt exposed, humiliated, angry. Yet Paris also offered glimpses of something different. He began attending the lectures of Maurice Merleau-Ponty at the Sorbonne, brilliant explorations of embodiment and perception. He discovered the theater of Antonin Artaud with its transgressive violence and refusal of bourgeois good taste. He went to concerts of contemporary music, experiencing the dissonance and experimentation of the post-war avant-garde. These encounters showed him that there were ways of living and thinking that refused conventional categories. And he met people who would matter. Jean Hippolyte, the great Hegel scholar, became a mentor, recognizing in Michel's work a rigor and originality that deserved cultivation. Louis Althusser, another ENS professor, encouraged Michel's interest in the history of science and epistemology. These relationships gave Michel what his family never had: intellectual validation, the sense that his particular way of thinking was not defective, but valuable. But perhaps most importantly, Michel began to formulate the question that would drive all his future work. If he was sick, who had decided that? If his desires made him abnormal, who had created the norm? If psychiatry could define him as pathological, where did psychiatry get its authority? The personal and the philosophical were completely intertwined. Every attempt to cure or correct him, every clinical diagnosis, every pitying or contemptuous glance became evidence in an investigation he was conducting into the nature of power itself. He started reading the history of medicine, tracing how categories of illness changed over time. What had been called melancholy became depression. What had been possession became psychosis. The transformations were not simple progress toward truth, but shifts in how knowledge and power organized human experience. Michel began to see that his own suffering was not just personal, but historical, that he was living through a particular regime of truth that defined some forms of desire as healthy and others as sick. This insight did not make the pain go away. He still woke at 3 a.m, crushed by anxiety and self-loathing. He still felt the desperate loneliness of living split in two, showing one face to the world while hiding everything essential. He still sometimes thought about dying as a kind of relief, an escape from the impossible tension of his existence. But understanding began to create distance. If these categories were historical constructs rather than natural facts, then they could be challenged, resisted, maybe even transformed. Michel started reading Nietzsche more seriously, absorbing the idea that morality had a genealogy, that values were not discovered but created. He read Freud, not accepting the orthodoxy but learning to think about how desire gets shaped and channeled. He read Marx on ideology, on how our very consciousness reflects the social conditions we live within. By the time he completed his studies at Normal in 1952, Michel Foucault, he would drop the Paul from his name, refusing his father's claim on him, had survived. Barely, but survived. He had his aggregation, the teaching qualification that would let him support himself. He had begun to develop a method for thinking about the questions that tormented him. And he had made a decision He would never become what his father wanted. He would not be a doctor who cured bodies. He would be a philosopher who examined how we came to need curing in the first place. The boy who could not fit had become a young man determined to understand why fitting was demanded at all. The personal wound was becoming intellectual work, the private suffering transforming into a project that would eventually reshape how we think about sanity and madness, normal and abnormal, the free subject and the forces that constitute it. Paris stretched before him, still dangerous, still demanding careful navigation, but also full of archives waiting to be explored, questions waiting to be asked, a life waiting to be invented on his own terms rather than anyone else's. The real work was about to begin. The fugitive from Poitiers was about to become the archaeologist of knowledge, digging through history's layers to expose the arbitrary foundations on which the present stood. And though the struggle was far from over, would never really be over, Michel Foucault had found his weapon. Not acceptance, not cure, but relentless questioning of every truth that claimed to be natural. The philosophy of someone who had been told what he was and had learned to ask instead how he had been made to be that and whether he might become something else entirely. After finishing at Normal in 1952, Michel Foucault did what many young intellectuals in his position would do. He took a teaching post at a provincial university and began working toward his doctorate. But Michel was not like most young intellectuals. The weight of living in Paris, of navigating its gay underground while maintaining his academic reputation, of being constantly observed and monitored after his suicide attempts, had become unbearable. He needed to escape, to find a place where he could breathe without the constant pressure of surveillance. The opportunity came through a position at a psychiatric hospital in Lille, in northern France. Michel took it not because he was interested in clinical work, but because he needed to understand the machinery of diagnosis that had been turned on him so many times. If psychiatry claimed the authority to define him as sick, he wanted to see how that authority actually operated, not in textbooks, but in the daily routines of an institution. He arrived at the hospital in the autumn of 1952, moving into staff housing that smelled of disinfectant and boiled vegetables. The building was old, converted from something else, with long corridors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. Michel was assigned to administer psychological tests to patients, the Rorschach ink blots and word associations that were supposed to reveal the hidden structures of the psyche. What struck him immediately was how arbitrary it all seemed. The same response to an ink blot could be interpreted as healthy or pathological depending on the examiner's prior assumptions about the patient. A working-class person showing imagination might be labeled as losing touch with reality, while a bourgeois person giving the same response demonstrated creativity. Michel sat across from patients, holding his cards and his scoring sheets, and felt increasingly like he was participating in a ritual whose only real function was to confirm what had already been decided. He watched the psychiatrists move through the ward with their absolute certainty, their confident diagnoses, their prescriptions of insulin shock and electroconvulsive therapy. They spoke about patients in their presence as if the patients were not there, reducing them to symptoms and syndromes. Michel saw the violence of it, the way the medical gaze turned human suffering into clinical categories, stripping away everything particular and individual to produce a legible case. But he also noticed something else. The patients often seemed to understand their situations more clearly than the doctors did. They knew they were being managed rather than healed. They performed the behaviors that would get them released, or at least make their lives easier. They had developed their own counter-knowledge, their own ways of navigating the institutional machinery. The relationship between doctor and patient was not simply domination, but a complex game with rules both sides understood, even if only one side was supposed to have power. After a year in Lille, Michel fled further. He took a position as a French cultural attaché in Uppsala, Sweden, about as far from Paris as he could get while remaining in Western Europe. He left France in 1955, and the departure felt like exile and liberation in equal measure.
Sweden was cold, dark half the year, a country where he barely spoke the language. It was perfect. Uppsala was a university town, quiet and orderly, built around a medieval cathedral that rose above low wooden houses painted in soft colors. Michel rented an apartment near the university, a simple space with large windows that let in what little light the winter offered. For the first time in his adult life, he was truly alone, anonymous in a way that had never been possible in France. No one here knew his history. No one was watching him with the concerned surveillance of authority. He could simply disappear into his work.
And the work was about disappearance itself, about how people vanished into categories, how madness had become a way of making certain kinds of human experience invisible by making them too visible, marked and contained. Michel had decided on his doctoral topic, the history of madness. He wanted to know when and how madness had become mental illness, transformed from a spiritual or social condition into a medical category requiring confinement and cure. The Uppsala University Library became his home. He arrived when it opened and stayed until closing, working in the same spot day after day, surrounded by books and languages he was teaching himself to read. Medical treatises from the 17th and 18th centuries, police records, letters from families requesting the confinement of troublesome relatives, hospital registers listing admissions and deaths. He worked through these documents with the patience of an archaeologist, brushing away layers of accumulated interpretation to see what lay beneath. What he discovered astonished him. Madness had not always been medicalized. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, the mad wandered freely, often seen as touched by God or possessed by demons, but not fundamentally separate from the community. There were fools and madmen in Shakespeare, but they spoke truth that the sane could not. There was a rich symbolic tradition that saw madness as having its own wisdom, its own access to realities hidden from rational consciousness. Then something changed. In 1656, by royal decree, Paris opened the Hôpital Général, not a hospital in the medical sense, but a vast confinement house. Within months, 1% of the city's population, the unemployed, vagrants, libertines, the mad, had been locked away. Similar institutions opened across Europe. This was the Great Confinement, as Michel called it, a massive reorganization of social space that separated the reasonable from the unreasonable. But the confined were not primarily mad. They were people who did not fit the emerging bourgeois work ethic, the idler, the debauched, those who would not or could not participate in productive labor. Madness was one category among many, and it was not yet primarily medical. It was moral, economic, a failure to live according to the values of an emerging social order. Only later, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, did madness become mental illness. Physicians entered the confinement houses and began distinguishing the mad from other inmates. Pinel in France, Tuque in England. Reformers who claimed to be liberating the mad from their chains, and in a sense they were. The mad were unchained, given their own institutions, treated with something approaching therapeutic intent. But Michel saw the other side of this liberation. As madness became illness, it also became the property of medical expertise. The mad person's own experience was discounted. What mattered was the doctor's diagnosis, the clinical gaze that could see through surface symptoms to underlying pathology. The asylum replaced the dungeon, but it was still confinement, still separation, still a fundamental denial of the mad person's status as a full human subject. He worked on this material with an obsessive intensity that worried the few friends he made in Uppsala. He barely ate. He slept irregularly, sometimes not at all for days, then crashing into exhausted oblivion. The research was not just intellectual for him, it was deeply, painfully personal. Every document about how homosexuality had been classified as mental illness felt like a document about his own life. Every description of treatment and cure echoed the psychiatrists who had tried to fix him. But the distance of Sweden allowed him to transform personal pain into historical analysis.
He was not just a victim of psychiatric classification, he was an archaeologist excavating the conditions that made such classification possible. He was documenting the arbitrary foundations of what claimed to be objective medical truth.
During his time in Sweden, Michel had a love affair that briefly made him happier than he had been in years. The man was a composer, someone he met through Uppsala's small artistic community. Their relationship was relatively open by Swedish standards, though still necessarily discreet. For a few months, Michel experienced what it might be like to live without constant fear of exposure, to come home to someone who knew him completely. But the relationship could not last. Michel's intensity, his alternating withdrawal and neediness, his absolute commitment to work above all else, eventually became too much. They parted amicably but with sadness on both sides. Michel retreated further into his research, using loneliness as fuel for productivity. He also traveled during these years, taking positions in Warsaw and Hamburg, always restless, always moving. In Poland, he encountered a very different kind of surveillance. The state's apparatus turned on its own citizens. But he noticed that the mechanisms were not entirely different from what he had been studying. Different ideologies, different justifications, but the same fundamental operations: observation, classification, normalization, the production of subjects who internalize control. By 1960, Michel had been working on his thesis for 5 years. The manuscript had grown enormous, over 900 pages in its first draft, a sprawling history that traced the concept of madness from the Renaissance to the 19th century. He was trying to do something that had never been done before, not write a history of psychiatric progress, of enlightened science gradually understanding mental illness better, but write a history of madness itself, of how the categories we use to think about unreason have changed, and what those changes reveal about power. His committee back in France was getting impatient. A doctoral thesis was supposed to be a focused demonstration of scholarly competence, not a 1,000-page philosophical epic. But Michel's mentor, Georges Canguilhem, a philosopher of science who understood what Michel was attempting, defended him. This was original work, Canguilhem argued, worth waiting for. Michel returned to France to defend his thesis in 1961. The defense took place at the Sorbonne, in a formal ritual that had changed little since the Middle Ages. He stood before a panel of professors in their robes and presented his work, arguing that madness was not a natural category discovered by progressive science, but a cultural construct that served specific social functions. The examiners were divided. Some saw brilliance, others saw excess, a thesis that read more like literature than proper scholarship. But they passed him, awarding the doctorate with reservations about the work's unorthodox style. Michel walked out of the Sorbonne with his degree, feeling less triumph than relief. He had survived another institutional gauntlet. The outsider had forced his way inside, though he had no intention of becoming comfortable there. The thesis was published in 1961 as Folie et déraison, Histoire de la folie à l'âge classique, later translated as Madness in Civilization. It was unlike any academic work that had come before. Michel wrote with a passion that verged on poetry, describing the 17th century confinement houses as places where unreason was locked away, not for medical reasons, but because it troubled the emerging order of bourgeois rationality. He argued that the modern asylum, for all its humanitarian pretensions, was fundamentally continuous with earlier forms of confinement. It still separated the mad from society, still denied them the status of speaking subjects, still imposed meanings from outside rather than listening to the mad person's own experience. The only difference was that now this separation was justified medically rather than morally, which made it harder to resist because it claimed the authority of science. The book's most radical claim came in its introduction. Michel suggested that madness and civilization were locked in a dialogue, that what got classified as madness was actually civilization's other, the excluded possibility that had to be silenced for reason to establish its dominion. Madness was not simply the absence of reason, but its constitutive outside, the boundary that defined what counted as rational by designating what did not.
This meant that the history of madness was also the history of reason itself, of how Western civilization had established its particular form of rationality by excluding and pathologizing other ways of experiencing and knowing. The mad were not simply sick people who needed treatment. They were exiles from a conflict that went to the heart of what it meant to be human, to be a subject, to be sane. Critics attacked the book from multiple directions. Psychiatrists dismissed it as the work of someone who did not understand medicine. Historians quibbled with his use of sources. Marxists complained that he ignored economic structures in favor of abstract ideas about reason and unreason. But others recognized that something important had happened, that this strange book had opened new ways of thinking about institutions and power and the production of knowledge. Michel himself was already moving on. He had said what he needed to say about madness, had worked through his own experiences by transforming them into historical analysis. He would return to these themes throughout his life, but never again in quite this way. The personal wound that had driven the work remained, but he had learned to make it productive, to turn suffering into a tool for excavating the historical conditions that made such suffering possible. Looking back on his time in Uppsala, on those years spent alone in archives reading about how people were classified and confined, Michel would later say that he had been trying to write the history of the present, not just the past, but the forces that shaped his own moment, his own experience. Every document about 17th century confinement houses was also a document about the psychiatric surveillance he had endured. Every analysis of how madness became medicalized was also an analysis of how his sexuality had been pathologized. He had taken his own exclusion, his status as abnormal, and used it to see what those on the inside could not. He had transformed the position of the outsider into an epistemological advantage, a vantage point from which the arbitrariness of norms became visible. This would become his method, repeated again and again in different domains. Take what appears natural and necessary, trace its history, show that it was constructed, and in showing that construction, reveal that it could be otherwise. The boy who could not fit had become the archaeologist who showed that the spaces we are supposed to fit into have histories, that they were built by specific people for specific purposes, and that their foundations are not as solid as they appear. Michel Foucault was 35 years old, newly doctored, and just beginning to understand the power of his own particular way of seeing. He would never be comfortable, never quite belong, but he had learned to make that discomfort productive, to ask the questions that only someone on the margins could ask, to refuse the naturalness of everything that those on the inside took for granted. The next phase of his work would push further, would examine not just madness, but the entire apparatus of modern power, the ways we are all, sane and mad, normal and deviant, shaped into subjects who govern themselves.
But for now, returning to Paris with his doctorate and his published book, Michel allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had done what he set out to do. He had explained something about why he suffered, and in explaining it, had made that suffering mean something beyond itself. The personal had become political. The wound had become weapon, and the excluded had spoken back to the system that tried to silence him. The archives awaited with more secrets. The institutions of modern power had more mechanisms to expose. And Michel Foucault, archaeologist of knowledge, genealogist of power, was ready to keep digging. Paris in the late 1960s was burning, or at least it felt that way. Students occupied the Sorbonne in May 1968, tearing up cobblestones to throw at police, writing graffiti on ancient walls that declared, "Under the paving stones, the beach," and "It is forbidden to forbid." Michel Foucault was at the new experimental university in Vincennes, watching his students barricade themselves inside buildings and demand the complete transformation of education, of society, of everything. He was 42 years old, a respected if controversial professor, and he felt an unexpected exhilaration watching the certainties of the old order crack open. For weeks, Paris existed in a kind of carnival of possibility. Workers joined the students, factories were occupied, the government nearly fell, and then, gradually, the moment passed.
Order was restored. De Gaulle remained in power. The revolution that had seemed so close receded like a wave pulling back from shore. But something had shifted for Michel. The uprising had shown him that power was more fragile than it appeared, that the structures everyone took for granted could be challenged, shaken, maybe even broken. But it had also shown him something else, that he did not fully understand how power actually worked. The students had seized buildings and proclaimed their freedom, and then they had been dispersed by police and returned to their old lives. Why? What mechanisms kept people in place even after they had experienced the possibility of radical change? He began to feel that his earlier work, brilliant as it was, had been insufficient. Madness and Civilization had shown how categories were constructed historically, but it had remained mostly in the realm of ideas, discourse, representation. He needed to understand how power operated, not just in what people thought, but in what they did, in their bodies, in the organization of space and time, in the mundane details of daily life. In 1970, Michel was appointed to the Collège de France, the highest academic honor in the French system, a position for life, no teaching requirements except an annual public lecture on his current research. He was given the title Professor of the History of Systems of Thought, a chair created specifically for him. At 44, he had arrived at the pinnacle of French intellectual life. His inaugural lecture was packed, people standing in the aisles and sitting on the floor to hear him. Michel stood at the podium, visibly nervous despite his years of public speaking, and delivered an address that was really about fear. I would have preferred to be enveloped by discourse, he began, and carried away beyond all possible beginnings. There would have been a voice behind me, speaking before I did. He was describing his anxiety about authority, about taking up this position of power and knowledge, about becoming the kind of figure who pronounced truth from on high.
But he was also laying out a program. He wanted to study not the content of knowledge, but its conditions of possibility, the rules that determined what could be said and thought in any given period. And increasingly, he wanted to understand these rules not as abstract epistemology, but as material practices, as things that happened in institutions, in bodies, in the organization of daily life. He started going to prisons, not as a reformer or a humanitarian visitor, but as someone trying to understand how modern power actually worked. In 1971, he founded the Prison Information Group, or GIP, bringing together ex-prisoners, activists, and intellectuals to document conditions inside French prisons and to amplify prisoners' own voices about their experiences. Michel attended meetings in dingy community centers where former inmates described the reality of incarceration, the constant surveillance, the arbitrary punishments, the way time was regimented down to the minute, every moment accounted for, every action scheduled. He listened to descriptions of solitary confinement, of the psychological torture of being watched constantly or of being completely isolated. And he began to see prison not as an aberration, but as a crystallized form of techniques that operated everywhere in modern society. He read everything he could find about the history of punishment, torture and execution in the Ancien Régime, the shift toward imprisonment in the 18th and 19th centuries, the emergence of the modern penitentiary, and he noticed something that changed everything. Punishment had not become more humane because society had become more enlightened. It had changed form because a new kind of power needed different techniques. The old power of sovereigns had worked through spectacular displays of violence, public executions where the condemned was tortured for hours while crowds watched. The sovereign's power was demonstrated on the body of the criminal, made visible through the infliction of pain. This was power that said, I can destroy you, obey, or die. But modern power worked differently. It did not primarily operate through violence or even the threat of violence. It worked through discipline, through training bodies to behave in certain ways, through creating subjects who internalized norms and policed themselves.
The goal was not to punish crime, but to prevent it by producing docile bodies that did not want to deviate. Michel became obsessed with an architectural design called the Panopticon, invented by the 18th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham. It was a plan for a perfect prison, a circular building with cells around the perimeter and a central watchtower. Each cell would be backlit so the guard in the tower could see every prisoner at all times, but the prisoners could not see the guard. They would never know whether they were being watched at any given moment. The brilliance of the design was its efficiency. The guard might not even be there, but the prisoners would have to act as if they were always being watched. External surveillance would become internal self-surveillance. The prisoners would discipline themselves. Power would operate not through the guard's physical presence, but through the prisoner's knowledge that they might be observed.
Bentham thought he had designed a rational, humane prison. Michel saw something else, a diagram of modern power itself. We lived, he realized, in a society that had generalized the Panopticon principle. Schools, factories, hospitals, barracks, all organized space so that behavior could be observed, recorded, evaluated, normalized. We had all become prisoners who had internalized the watcher's gaze. He began writing what would become Discipline and Punish, working with the same obsessive intensity he had brought to his thesis on madness. He wrote in his apartment on Rue de Vaugirard, surrounded by books and documents, filling legal pads with his small, precise handwriting. He worked late into the night, sometimes until dawn, smoking constantly, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours before. The book opened with a scene of almost unbearable violence, the execution of Robert François Damiens in 1757, who had attempted to assassinate Louis XV. Michel described in clinical detail how Damiens was tortured for hours in front of a crowd, flesh torn with red-hot pincers, molten lead and boiling oil poured into the wounds, horses attached to his limbs to pull him apart. The execution took hours because his body refused to come apart easily. Finally, the executioners had to cut through his joints with knives. Then Michel jumped forward less than a century to a prison timetable from 1837. Wake at 6, wash, morning prayer, work from 8 to 10, lunch, more work, dinner, evening prayer, bed at 9. Every moment accounted for, every movement prescribed. No spectacular violence, just the relentless organization of time and space. This was the transformation Michel wanted to explain, from torture to timetable, from sovereign power that destroyed the body to disciplinary power that trained it. The shift was not toward greater humanity, but toward greater efficiency. The modern prison did not primarily punish, it attempted to remake the criminal into a productive subject. And the prison was just one institution among many. Schools organized children's bodies in space, arranging them in rows where they could be observed, teaching them to sit still, to raise their hands, to speak only when recognized. Hospitals arranged patients in beds that could be inspected during rounds, creating clinical cases out of individual suffering. Factories organized workers into production lines where every movement could be timed and evaluated. All of these institutions used similar techniques: hierarchical observation, normalizing judgment, and examination. Hierarchical observation meant organizing space so that behavior was always visible to those in authority. Normalizing judgment meant constantly measuring behavior against a standard and punishing deviation not as crime, but as abnormality. Examination combined these, turning individuals into documented cases whose every detail was recorded and analyzed. Michel called this assemblage of techniques disciplinary power, and he argued that it had emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries alongside capitalism and the modern state. It was not a conspiracy or a plan, but a kind of collective innovation, techniques developed in different institutions that proved useful for managing populations and producing productive subjects. The most disturbing part was how this power claimed to be liberation. Schools said they were educating free citizens. Prisons said they were rehabilitating criminals. Hospitals said they were healing the sick. and in each case, the institution was actually producing a particular kind of subject, training people to govern themselves according to norms they had internalized.
Michel saw this everywhere once he knew to look for it. The way children learned to control their bodies in school, sitting still for hours, learning that their natural impulses were wrong and needed correction. The way workers internalized factory discipline, showing up on time, organizing their lives around the clock, measuring their worth in productivity. The way patients learned to describe their symptoms in medical language, translating their own experience into categories the doctor could recognize. We were all being normalized, Michel argued, turned into cases, documented and analyzed and measured against standards we did not create. And the genius of modern power was that we experienced this normalization as freedom, as our natural development, as becoming our true selves. He wrote about biopower, the way modern states managed entire populations through statistics and public health measures. Vaccination campaigns, hygiene education, demographic surveys, all of these created a new object, the population, with its birth rates and mortality rates, its health and productivity. Power was no longer just about controlling individual bodies, but about managing the life processes of entire groups. And sex became crucial to biopower. On one hand, sex was intensely private, the most intimate aspect of individual life. On the other hand, it connected to reproduction, to population growth, to the transmission of disease. So sex became an object of endless discourse, confession, medical examination. We were told to talk about it, analyze it, bring it into the light where it could be known and managed. Michel was writing about mechanisms of power, but he was also writing about himself. Every analysis of how discipline produced docile bodies resonated with his own experience of being trained, corrected, normalized. Every discussion of how sexuality became an object of confession echoed his experiences with psychiatrists who wanted him to confess his desires so they could cure them. But now he had a framework for understanding these experiences not as personal failures but as operations of power. He was not sick. He was someone who had been subjected to normalizing techniques and had refused to be normalized. His difference was not pathology, but a position from which to see how normalization worked. Discipline and Punish was published in 1975. The book became an immediate sensation, selling in numbers unheard of for academic philosophy. People who had never read Foucault suddenly encountered his ideas, often in simplified form, the Panopticon becoming shorthand for surveillance society. But Michel was frustrated by some of the responses. People treated the book as a critique of prisons, as if he were simply arguing that prisons were bad and should be reformed. He had tried to show something more complex, that the entire modern social order operated through disciplinary techniques, that prisons were just the most visible instance of mechanisms that worked everywhere. Reform would not solve the problem because the problem was not that prisons failed to rehabilitate. The problem was that rehabilitation meant normalization, meant producing subjects who accepted their own subjection. Real resistance would require refusing to be the kind of subject that disciplinary power tried to produce. This was where Michel's political commitments became murky, and he knew it. If power was everywhere, operating through the most mundane practices, how did you resist? If even resistance could be captured and normalized, the rebellious student becoming the radical professor, the criminal becoming the reformed citizen, what hope was there for genuine transformation? He did not have clear answers, and he was honest about that, but he believed that understanding how power worked was the first step toward resisting it. You could not fight mechanisms you did not see. Making power visible, showing how it operated, creating a kind of manual for recognizing its techniques, this was the contribution he could make.
And there was something else, something he was just beginning to articulate. If the modern subject was produced through disciplinary techniques, then that subject was not inevitable. We were not born as individuals with an essential nature that society either repressed or liberated. We were made into particular kinds of subjects through specific historical practices, and what had been made could potentially be unmade, remade differently. This thought was liberating and terrifying in equal measure. If there was no essential self beneath the layers of socialization, then who was Michel Foucault? Not the stable identity he had spent years trying to discover and express, but an ongoing process, a series of practices and relations, something that could be worked on and transformed. He began thinking about what he called practices of the self, techniques people used to shape their own existence, not accepting the identity that power assigned you, but actively working to create yourself differently. He did not yet have the full framework for these ideas. That would come later, but the direction was clear. In his lectures at the Collège de France, Michel ranged across centuries and topics, always returning to the same fundamental question: how did we become subjects? Not in the grammatical sense of the subject of a sentence, but subjects in the dual sense of being subject to power and being the kind of subject who experienced themselves as an I, as someone with an interior life, desires, a truth to discover. His lectures were packed, the amphitheater filled to capacity and beyond, people sitting on the steps and standing against the walls. Michel spoke without much eye contact, reading from his notes, but his ideas were electrifying. He was giving people a way to understand their own experiences of being judged, measured, normalized. He was showing that the most intimate aspects of their lives, their sexuality, their sense of self, their desires, were not simply personal but historical, shaped by power relations that could be analyzed and potentially resisted. But the work was taking its toll. Michel was drinking heavily, smoking 2 packs a day, sleeping irregularly. His health, never robust, was deteriorating. Friends noticed he looked older than his years, his face lined with exhaustion, his energy manic and fragile. He was burning himself out, consuming his own body in the service of understanding how bodies were consumed by power. And he was restless, unsatisfied with Paris and its intellectual scene. He had conquered French academic life, but felt constrained by it, by the expectations that came with his position, by the same surveillance he was analyzing in his work. He needed to find a place where he could explore the questions that were opening up, where he could live differently, where he could experiment with being someone other than the famous philosopher Michel Foucault. That place, improbably, would be San Francisco, a city on the edge of the continent where people were inventing new forms of life, new sexualities, new ways of relating that had no name in the old vocabularies. Michel had visited briefly in 1975 and been astonished by what he found. Now he was planning to return, to spend real time there, to see if the theories he was developing about power and resistance and the creation of the self could be lived rather than just written. The archaeologist of madness and the anatomist of discipline was about to become an experimenter in living. The intellectual work would continue, but it would be joined by something else, the attempts to create a life that refused the normalizing imperatives he had spent years analyzing. The question was no longer just how did we become subjects, but what else might we become? The night was deepening outside his Paris apartment, but Michel sat at his desk, writing, smoking, thinking. The mechanisms of power were clearer to him now than they ever had been. But clarity about constraint was not the same as freedom. That would require something more dangerous, more uncertain. It would require stepping outside the safe positions, the academic prestige, the respectability he never quite fit into anyway. Ahead lay California, leather bars, experiments with pleasure and pain that would shock his Parisian colleagues. Ahead lay new books, new ideas, and a disease that had no name yet but was already moving through the communities he would join. Ahead lay the final transformation of his thought and his life, the last chapters of a story that had begun with a boy who could not fit and would end with a philosopher who showed that fitting was never the point. But tonight the work called. There were still mechanisms to expose, still practices to analyze, still ways that power moved through the world that needed to be made visible. Michel Foucault, anatomist of surveillance, returned to his manuscript, his pen moving across the page in the lamplight, mapping the cage so carefully that the bars themselves began to dissolve.
Michel Foucault arrived in San Francisco in the autumn of 1975 and felt something he had not felt since leaving provincial France decades ago: the possibility of breathing freely. The city rose from hills that climbed steeply from the bay, pastel Victorian houses stacked like a child's blocks, fog rolling in from the Pacific each evening to wrap everything in soft gray. But what struck him most was not the physical beauty. It was the sense that people here were inventing new ways to live, refusing the scripts they had been handed, creating forms of existence that had no precedent. He had been invited to give lectures at Berkeley, across the bay from San Francisco, a university still vibrating with the energy of the student movements that had rocked it in the 1960s. But Michel spent as little time as possible in academic spaces. He wanted to see what was happening in the Castro, the neighborhood that had become the center of gay San Francisco, where rainbow flags flew from buildings and men walked hand in hand down the street in broad daylight without fear. This openness was shocking to someone who had spent his entire life hiding. In Paris, even in 1975, gay life existed in shadows: coded glances in certain cafes, dangerous encounters in public toilets, the constant vigilance required to maintain a respectable public identity while meeting your actual needs in secret. Michel had perfected this double life, but the strain of it never eased. He was famous, celebrated, invited to speak across Europe, and he could not acknowledge publicly the most basic fact of his existence. But in the Castro, on those steep streets lined with bars and bookstores and community centers, men were simply themselves. They kissed on corners. They argued about politics and art with the unself-conscious intensity of people who did not have to spend energy hiding. Michel walked through this neighborhood in a daze of recognition and longing. This was what he had been writing about in abstract terms: the possibility of refusing the subject position that power assigned you, made concrete in architecture and daily life. He went to the bars, not the elegant, discreet establishments he knew in Paris, but loud, crowded places where disco music pounded and men danced with abandon. He had never been much of a dancer, too self-conscious about his body, too aware of being watched. But here, in the anonymous crush of bodies, something loosened. He was just another man in the crowd, not the famous philosopher, not the professor weighing every word. Just a body moving to music, feeling desire without shame or calculation. And he discovered the leather bars, the stud, the ambush, places where men explored power and pain and pleasure in combinations that had no name in the existing vocabularies of sexuality. This was not the violence of domination that Michel had spent years analyzing. This was something stranger and more interesting: consensual theater, carefully negotiated scenes where power was exchanged like a gift, where pain became a pathway to intensity rather than a tool of subjugation. Michel was fascinated. Here were people using their bodies in ways that explicitly played with power, that turned domination into a game with rules both parties agreed to, that separated power from its usual context of institutional authority and made it something you could explore, experiment with, use for purposes it was never designed for. This was what he had been groping toward theoretically: power as relation rather than possession, as something that moved through interactions rather than being held by individuals. He began participating, cautiously at first, then with increasing boldness. The leather scene had its own elaborate codes, its own ethics. You negotiated what would happen. You established safe words that would stop everything immediately. You took care of your partner, checking in, making sure intensity did not cross into actual harm. And within these careful boundaries, you could go to places of extraordinary vulnerability and strength. For Michel, this was more than sexual adventure. It was research, though not in any conventional academic sense. He was exploring the limits of pleasure, testing what bodies could do when freed from normalization, experiencing firsthand what it meant to create practices of the self that refused the identities power assigned. the same body that had been pathologized by psychiatrists, that had been marked as sick and deviant, could become an instrument of pleasure deliberately chosen and crafted. He made friends in San Francisco, people unlike anyone in his Parisian circles, artists and activists, radicals who had dropped out of conventional life to create alternatives, men who had been disowned by families and had built new families based on affinity rather than blood. They knew he was a professor from France, but they did not treat him with the deference he received in academic settings. They argued with him, challenged him, invited him to parties where the conversation ranged from high theory to the best bathhouses, with the easy fluidity of people for whom thought and life were not separate domains. One friend, a sculptor named Paul, took Michel to the desert outside Los Angeles, to a place where the sky was so dark at night you could see stars thick as spilled salt. They took LSD, something Michel had never done, and for hours he lay on the cooling sand watching the sky wheel above him, feeling the boundaries of his self dissolve and reform. He understood in his body what he had been trying to articulate intellectually, that the subject was not a fixed thing, but a process, constantly made and remade, that identity was not discovery but creation. Back in Paris, between trips to California, Michel's friends noticed he had changed. He seemed lighter somehow, younger. He dressed differently, abandoning the somber suits for leather jackets and turtlenecks. He talked about San Francisco with an enthusiasm that was unlike his usual intellectual distance. Some of his colleagues were disturbed. This was not how a professor at the Collège de France was supposed to behave. There were whispers about his activities, concern that he was damaging his reputation. Michel did not particularly care. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing something like joy, and he was not willing to sacrifice it for respectability. He had spent decades analyzing how power worked through normalization, how we were all trained to police ourselves and each other. Now he was deliberately refusing that self-policing, choosing to live in ways that the respectable world would condemn. But he was also thinking hard about what this freedom meant theoretically, because even as he experienced liberation in San Francisco, he was writing a book that questioned the very concept of liberation. The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, was taking shape during these years, and its central argument was profoundly counterintuitive.
Michel argued that the story we told ourselves about sexuality was backwards. We believed that the Victorians had repressed sexuality, covered it in silence and shame, and that the 20th century had liberated it through increasingly frank discussion and acceptance. Freud, the sexual revolution, gay liberation, these were all understood as progressive movements freeing sexuality from repression. But Michel saw something else in the archives he had been studying. The 19th century had not silenced sexuality, it had produced an explosion of discourse about sex. Confession in the Catholic Church became increasingly focused on sexual sins, requiring penitents to examine and articulate their desires in minute detail. Medicine developed sexology, creating elaborate taxonomies of perversions and deviations. Psychology made sexuality central to human identity, claiming that your sexual desires revealed your deepest truth. All of this discourse did not liberate sexuality, it created it as an object of knowledge and power. Before the 19th century, sexual acts were things you did, sometimes sinful, sometimes not, but not constitutive of a fundamental identity. After the 19th century, sexuality became who you were. The homosexual was not just someone who performed certain acts, but a type of person, a species, someone whose entire being was organized around their deviant desire. And this transformation was not repression, but a form of power that worked through incitement rather than prohibition. We were encouraged to talk about sex, to confess it to doctors and therapists, to discover our sexual truth and express it. But this endless speaking was also a form of control, turning our most intimate experiences into data that could be analyzed, classified, normalized. Michel called this the repressive hypothesis, the idea that power primarily worked through saying no to sexuality, and he argued it was fundamentally wrong. Power did not primarily repress desire, it produced it, shaped it, gave it forms and names, turned it into identity. We thought we were liberating ourselves by speaking openly about sexuality, but we were actually submitting to another form of power, one that required us to confess our deepest secrets so they could be known and managed. This argument created a problem for Michel personally. If liberation was just another form of power, what was he experiencing in San Francisco? Was the freedom he felt just an illusion, another way of being captured by discourses of sexual identity? The gay liberation movement spoke the language of discovering your true self, coming out, being proud of who you really were. But Michel's analysis suggested that this true self was not discovered, but produced, that coming out meant accepting an identity that power had created. He wrestled with this contradiction. On one hand, his theoretical work showed that liberation discourse was complicit with power, that confessing your sexuality was a technique of subjection. On the other hand, he could not deny the reality of his own experience. Walking through the Castro, participating in the leather scene, living without constant fear of exposure, this felt genuinely different from the suffocating closet of Paris. The resolution, or at least the direction of one, came through rethinking what freedom might mean. Maybe liberation was the wrong framework entirely. Liberation implied freeing some essential nature from external constraints. But if there was no essential nature, only practices that produced subjects, then freedom could not be liberation. It would have to be something else, the refusal of what you have been made to be and the creation of new ways of being. Michel began using the phrase practices of the self to describe what he was trying to articulate, not liberation of a true self, but practices through which you worked on yourself, shaped your own existence, became a kind of artist of your own life. The leather scene was interesting not because it expressed some authentic gay identity, but because it created new forms of relationship, new uses of pleasure, new ways of being that did not fit existing categories.
This was a kind of freedom that did not require believing in an essential self waiting to be discovered. It was freedom as experimentation, as the ongoing work of refusing to be what power wanted you to be and inventing alternatives. And it was precarious, always vulnerable to being captured and normalized, turned into just another identity category that power could manage. He wrote about all of this in language that was abstract and philosophical, but underneath the theory was the pressure of lived experience. Every page of the history of sexuality was marked by the tension between intellectual skepticism and personal hope, between the analysis that showed how power captured resistance and the stubborn insistence that something else was possible. The book was published in 1976 and became immediately controversial. Feminists attacked it, arguing that Michel was ignoring the very real violence of sexual oppression, particularly against women. How could you say that repression was a myth when rape and domestic violence were endemic? Gay liberationists were also critical. They had fought for decades to be able to speak openly about their lives, and here was Foucault saying that confession was a technique of power. Michel tried to clarify. He was not saying that people were not oppressed or that speaking about sexuality was bad. He was trying to show that power was more complicated than we thought, that it did not work only through saying no, but also through saying yes, through encouraging certain kinds of speech and identity. Understanding this complexity was necessary for effective resistance. But the critiques stung because they touched something real. Michel's position was privileged. As a white man, as someone with academic credentials and institutional support, he could afford to be skeptical about liberation in ways that others could not. For someone who had been silenced, simply being able to speak was liberation, and no amount of theoretical sophistication should minimize that. He thought about this during his nights in San Francisco, in the bars where men gathered who had been rejected by their families, fired from jobs, arrested for their desires. For them, the ability to be openly gay was not just submission to an identity category imposed by power, it was survival, community, the difference between isolated suffering and collective life. Maybe both things were true simultaneously. The identity categories created by 19th century sexology were tools of power, ways of producing subjects who could be known and managed.
And they were also resources that people used to find each other, to build communities, to resist the very power that had created those categories. Power produced the category of homosexual, and homosexuals used that category to organize, to fight back, to create forms of life that escaped power's original intent. This double movement, power creating categories and people using those categories against power, became central to Michel's later thinking. Power was not simply dominating, it was productive, creative, always generating new forms of resistance even as it tried to capture them. And subjects were not simply dominated or liberated, but constantly negotiating, using the materials available to create lives that were never entirely what power intended. In 1978, Michel spent 3 months in San Francisco, the longest continuous stay he had made. He rented an apartment in the Castro, lived as just another resident of the neighborhood. He went to political meetings where people argued about strategy and tactics, about whether to work within the system or reject it entirely. He attended parties that lasted until dawn, where the conversation moved seamlessly between Hegel and the best tricks for getting past bar security. And he continued to explore the leather scene, going deeper into practices that his academic colleagues would have found incomprehensible or disturbing. But for Michel, this was not escape or transgression for its own sake. It was investigation, using his own body as laboratory to test the limits of what was possible, to experience intensities that exceeded existing categories. He began to think that pleasure itself might be a form of resistance, but not in the simple sense of indulging forbidden desires. Pleasure was interesting when it was unexpected, when it emerged from practices that used the body in ways it was not supposed to be used, that created sensations and relationships that had no name in the existing vocabularies. Pleasure that confirmed what you already knew about yourself was just consumption. But pleasure that surprised you, that showed you your body could do things you did not know were possible, that was something else. One night, after a particularly intense scene at a club, Michel sat on the steps outside catching his breath, and a stranger sat down next to him. They did not speak for a while, just sat in companionable silence, 2 men in leather jackets cooling down in the San Francisco night. Finally, the stranger asked what Michel did, and he said he was a teacher, which was true if incomplete. The stranger nodded and said he was a carpenter, and they talked about work, about the satisfaction of making things, about how your hands learned things your mind did not know.
Later, walking back to his apartment, Michel thought about that conversation. The stranger had no idea who Michel Foucault was, had talked to him as just another person, and there was a freedom in that anonymity that felt precious. In Paris, he was always the famous philosopher, always performing that role. Here, he could be anyone, which meant he could be no one, which meant he could experiment with being someone he had not been before. But he also knew this could not last. He had responsibilities in Paris, his lectures at the Collège de France, the books he was writing, the students who depended on him. San Francisco was an escape, a laboratory, a place to test ideas and experiences, but it was not his whole life. Eventually, he would have to return to the constraints of academic life, to the surveillance and normalization he had spent years analyzing. Unless... The thought was forming, still inchoate but growing stronger. What if he could bring something of San Francisco back to Paris? Not the clubs and bars, those were specific to their context, but the attitude, the willingness to experiment, the refusal of predetermined identities. What if he could live in Paris the way he lived in San Francisco, refusing respectability, choosing to be visible in his difference rather than hiding it? It was a dangerous thought. France in the late 1970s was not California. Homosexuality was not illegal, but it was not accepted either, especially in the elite academic circles where Michel moved. Coming out publicly would have consequences. But Michel was tired of hiding. He had spent his entire life in shadows, and the sunlight of San Francisco had shown him what he was missing.
As the decade turned toward the 1980s, Michel made a decision. He would not exactly come out. The concept still felt too tied to ideas of discovering a true self that he rejected intellectually. But he would stop hiding, would speak more openly about his sexuality in contexts where it was relevant, would defend the practices and communities that mattered to him. And he would write differently, less abstractly, more connected to lived experience. The next volumes of the history of sexuality would move away from the mechanisms of power toward questions of ethics and self-creation. He wanted to explore how ancient Greeks and Romans had practiced forms of self-care, techniques for shaping your own existence that were not based on discovering your true nature, but on creating yourself as a work of art. This shift in his thinking was directly connected to his experiences in San Francisco. The leather scene had shown him that you could use practices, rituals, techniques, ways of relating to create forms of pleasure and connection that escaped existing scripts. The ancient Greeks and Romans had also developed practices of the self, different practices for different contexts, but sharing the same fundamental insight that life was something you worked on, shaped, perfected through deliberate techniques. Michel returned to Paris in early 1979 with notebooks full of ideas and a sense of purpose that felt different from his earlier driven productivity. He was no longer just analyzing power, he was trying to articulate an ethics for people who did not believe in essential human nature, who understood that we were produced by historical forces, but who still wanted to live well, to create lives worth living. The philosopher who had spent decades analyzing constraint was learning to think about freedom, not as liberation from power, but as the endless creative work of refusing what you have been told to be. The night deepened over Paris, but Michel sat at his desk, writing, thinking about pleasure and ethics, about practices of the self and the care of others, about how to live well in a world structured by power. The questions were getting more difficult, but also more urgent, more connected to the possibility of lives that mattered. He was no longer just the archaeologist or the anatomist. He was becoming something else, a practitioner, someone trying to live the questions rather than just analyze them. And though he could not know it, the final transformation of his thought and life was approaching, the last chapter where theory and practice would merge in the most profound and tragic way possible. The first reports appeared in 1981, buried in medical journals in gay newspapers. A rare cancer called Kaposi sarcoma was showing up in otherwise healthy young men in New York and San Francisco. Pneumocystis pneumonia, a disease that almost never affected people with functioning immune systems, was killing men in their 30s. The patients were mostly gay, and the medical establishment responded with the indifference reserved for populations it had never much cared about. By 1982, they had given it a name, gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID. The name itself was a form of violence, marking the disease as belonging to a particular community, as if it were punishment for a lifestyle rather than a virus that could affect anyone. The gay men of San Francisco and New York watched their friends waste away, developing the purple lesions of Kaposi sarcoma, suffering from infections their bodies could not fight, dying in hospital wards where nurses sometimes refused to enter their rooms. Michel Foucault was in San Francisco when the news started spreading through the Castro. He heard the whispered conversations in bars, the growing fear underneath the continued celebration. Men he had met at parties, danced with in clubs, explored pleasure with in private spaces were getting sick. Some disappeared from the scene, and rumors circulated about what had happened to them. The community that had felt so alive, so full of possibility, was beginning to realize it was under siege by something invisible and deadly. Michel returned to Paris in the summer of 1982 and threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. He was writing the second and third volumes of the history of sexuality, but the project had transformed completely from his original plan. He had intended to trace the emergence of modern sexuality through confession and psychiatry, but instead he found himself drawn backward in time, to ancient Greece and Rome, to ways of being that preceded the entire framework of sexual identity. He spent his days in libraries reading Greek and Roman philosophers who wrote about ethics not as obedience to law, but as practices of self-cultivation. Epictetus and Seneca, Marcus Aurelius and Plutarch, writers who treated life as something you worked on deliberately, shaping your own existence the way an artist shaped clay. They wrote about self-mastery, not in the sense of repressing desire, but of establishing the right relationship to pleasure, of using pleasure without being enslaved by it. Michel was particularly interested in how these ancient thinkers approached sexuality. They did not ask whether desires were normal or abnormal, healthy or pathological. They asked different questions. How much power does this pleasure have over you? Can you govern yourself, or are you governed by your appetites? The concern was not with the gender of your partner or the specific acts you performed, but with your capacity to maintain freedom in relation to pleasure. This was what Michel had been experiencing in San Francisco without quite having the language for it. The leather scene was not about liberation in the sense of expressing a repressed identity. It was about practices, techniques for using pleasure in ways that required self-mastery, even as they explored intensity and vulnerability. You negotiated carefully, established boundaries, took responsibility for yourself and your partner. You were free not because you indulged every impulse, but because you had developed the capacity to shape your own relationship to desire. He wrote about the ancient Greeks' concept of the use of pleasures, how free men were expected to cultivate moderation not through following laws, but through aesthetic self-fashioning. They were to be temperate not because pleasure was bad, but because excess indicated you were mastered by passion rather than mastering it. This was an ethics of freedom, but freedom understood as the capacity to govern yourself rather than being governed by forces outside you. Michel saw in these ancient practices a resource for thinking about ethics after the death of God, after the collapse of universal moral laws. If you did not believe in natural law or divine command, how should you live? The ancients offered an answer. Treat your life as a work of art, something to be shaped and perfected through deliberate practice. Ethics became aesthetics, the creation of a beautiful existence. But even as he wrote about ancient practices of self-care, Michel was becoming increasingly aware that something was wrong with his own body. He was tired in a way that rest did not fix. He had a persistent cough that would not resolve. His weight was dropping despite normal eating. He told himself it was the usual effects of overwork, stress, too many cigarettes, too much coffee, the accumulated wear of decades lived intensely. In the spring of 1983, he returned to San Francisco for what would be his final visit. The city had changed in ways that broke his heart. The bathhouses were still open, the bars still crowded, but underneath the familiar surfaces was a new atmosphere of fear. Men compared notes about who was sick, traded information about experimental treatments, tried to figure out what behaviors were dangerous and what were safe. No one knew how the disease spread. Some thought it was transmitted sexually. Others blamed poppers, the recreational drugs common in the scene. Some thought it was stress or a combination of factors. Michel attended a memorial service for someone he had known, a sweet man who had worked at one of the bookstores in the Castro. The service was held in an auditorium and it was packed with mourners. They shared memories, wept together, raged at the government's indifference to the epidemic killing them. President Reagan had not even mentioned the disease publicly, despite thousands of deaths. The National Institutes of Health were barely funding research. The message was clear. These lives did not matter. Michel sat in that auditorium surrounded by grieving men and felt rage unlike anything he had experienced. This was the culmination of everything he had been analyzing for decades. Power working through abandonment, through letting people die rather than actively killing them. The government did not need to execute gay men, it simply needed to withhold resources, ignore the epidemic, allow nature to take its course. This was biopolitics in its most brutal form, deciding which populations deserved to live and which could be allowed to die.
He went to the bars and clubs as he had always done, participating in the scene that had given him such freedom. But now there was defiance in it, a refusal to let fear stop the creation of pleasure and community. Some of his friends thought he was being reckless, that he should be more careful given what they were learning about transmission. But Michel had a fatalistic streak. If he was already infected, and by 1983, given his activities over the past several years, this seemed likely, then caution was pointless. He would live as he had chosen to live, refusing to let the disease dictate his existence before it even manifested. Back in Paris, his health deteriorated more noticeably. The cough worsened. He developed night sweats that left his sheets soaked. His friends urged him to see a doctor, but Michel resisted. He knew what they would find, and he was not ready to face it. Diagnosis would mean becoming a patient, submitting to medical authority, being turned into a case. He had spent his career analyzing how medicine produced subjects, and he did not want to become one. But by late 1983, he could no longer ignore the symptoms. He finally saw a doctor who ran tests. The results came back in early 1984. His immune system was collapsing. He had AIDS, though the doctor did not use that term directly. The disease still had no definitive test. That would not come until 1985, but the cluster of opportunistic infections and the pattern of immune suppression made the diagnosis clear. Michel received the news with a strange calm. He had known, really, for months. The diagnosis simply confirmed what his body had been telling him. He asked about prognosis, treatments, time. The doctor was honest. There were no effective treatments yet, only ways to manage symptoms. Most patients died within 2 years of diagnosis, many much sooner. Michel thanked him politely and left the office, walking out into the Paris afternoon with the knowledge that his life was ending. He did not tell most of his friends. He swore those who knew to secrecy. This was partly privacy, the same instinct that had made him guard his personal life for decades. But it was also refusal. If people knew he was dying, they would treat him differently, would see him as victim, would pity him. He wanted to remain Michel Foucault the philosopher for as long as possible, not Michel Foucault the AIDS patient. He worked with desperate urgency through the spring of 1984. The second and third volumes of the History of Sexuality were nearly complete, but he wanted to finish them, to say what he needed to say before his mind went along with his body. He wrote about the ancient Romans' practices of self-examination, techniques for monitoring your own thoughts and desires. He wrote about Christian confession and how it transformed ancient self-care into a requirement to confess sins and seek absolution. He was tracing a genealogy of the modern self, showing how the subject who confesses, who turns inward to discover their truth, who submits to expert interpretation of their desires, how this subject was not natural, but produced through specific historical practices. We were not born as confessional subjects. We were made into them through techniques that claimed to liberate us, but actually bound us to new forms of power.
But he was also writing about alternatives. The ancients showed that there had been other ways to work on the self, practices that were not about discovering your essential nature, but about creating yourself deliberately. This was what Michel wanted to preserve, to pass on, the possibility of an ethics not based on obedience or confession, but on aesthetic self-creation. His friends noticed he looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his movements slow and effortful. He canceled some of his lectures at the Collège de France, claiming fatigue. When he did lecture, he spoke more quietly than before, sometimes pausing mid-sentence as if he had lost his train of thought. The amphitheater was still packed. People came to hear Foucault even when he was clearly unwell, but the atmosphere had changed from intellectual excitement to something closer to vigil. By May, he was having trouble walking. His hip hurt constantly, the bones weakened by the disease. He developed toxoplasmosis, a parasite infection that attacked his brain, causing headaches, confusion, seizures. He was hospitalized at the Salpêtrière, the famous hospital where Charcot had studied hysteria in the 19th century, where the history of psychiatry that Michel had spent years analyzing had partly unfolded. The irony was not lost on him.
He lay in a hospital bed in an institution he had written about, being treated by doctors who saw him as a case, a set of symptoms to manage. The medical gaze he had spent decades analyzing was now turned on him, documenting his decline with the same clinical detachment he had once studied in archives. But he also experienced something he had not expected: the kindness of some of the medical staff. Nurses who treated him not as a diseased homosexual getting what he deserved, but as a human being suffering. Doctors who acknowledged the limits of what they could do while still trying to ease his pain. The care he received complicated his theories about medical power, showed him that institutions were not monolithic, that even within structures of domination, people could act with genuine compassion. His partner, Daniel Defert, stayed by his side. They had been together since the 1960s, their relationship surviving Michel's travels and affairs through a combination of loyalty and acceptance of each other's needs. Now, Daniel watched the man he loved waste away, his brilliant mind clouded by infection, his body failing piece by piece. Daniel would later found AIDS, France's first AIDS organization, transforming his grief into activism. Michel's family came to visit. His mother, elderly now, sat by his bed and held his hand, though they did not speak much. They had never been close, had never really understood each other, but in his dying, she was simply his mother and he was her son. His siblings came, awkward and sorrowful, facing the reality of his life that the family had spent decades politely ignoring. The hospital listed his condition as neurological infection, avoiding the stigmatized diagnosis. AIDS was still something shameful, something the respectable world did not acknowledge. Even in death, gay men were not permitted full recognition of their reality. This erasure, this insistence on euphemism and silence, was its own form of violence. Michel slipped in and out of consciousness through June. In his lucid moments, he asked about his manuscripts. Had they made it to the publisher? Would they be released? Daniel assured him everything was arranged. The books would appear. His work would continue after he was gone. He thought about San Francisco, about the nights in leather bars where he had experienced intensity and connection beyond anything his theories could capture. He thought about the men he had met there, many of them probably dead now or dying like him, their lives cut short by a disease and a government's indifference. He thought about pleasure and what it had meant to him, how it had been simultaneously his greatest source of suffering, the desire that made him pathological in the eyes of power, and his greatest source of freedom, the practices through which he had learned to create himself. On June 25, 1984, Michel Foucault died. He was 57 years old. The official cause of death was listed as septicemia, blood infection, a complication of AIDS that the death certificate did not name. The newspapers were circumspect in their obituaries, mentioning a long illness, avoiding specifics. His family requested that his sexuality not be discussed publicly. Even in death, the closet remained. But his work spoke what his life had been forced to whisper. Every analysis of how power worked through normalization was also a testament to his own experience of being marked as abnormal. Every investigation of how knowledge and power created subjects was also an account of how he had been subjected to psychiatric and social control. Every exploration of resistance and practices of the self was also a record of his attempts to live differently, to refuse what he had been told he was. The day after his death, Daniel went to Michel's apartment and found the manuscript of the 4th volume of the History of Sexuality, which Michel had been working on until his final hospitalization. It was unfinished, fragments and notes rather than a completed book. Michel had left instructions that nothing should be published posthumously, that only work he had approved should appear. Daniel respected this wish. The fragments remained unpublished for decades, a ghost text, the book Michel would have written if time had not run out. In the weeks and months after his death, the French intellectual world struggled with how to remember him. Some wanted to celebrate his contributions to philosophy and social theory, while carefully avoiding mention of his sexuality and the cause of his death. Others, particularly his students and the younger generation of activists, insisted on the inseparability of his life and work, on the necessity of acknowledging that he had died of AIDS, that his theories emerged from his embodied experience of marginalization and resistance. His books remained, and they found new readers who had never met him, but who recognized in his analyses something of their own experience. Women read him and saw the mechanisms through which gender was naturalized and enforced. Racial minorities read him and understood how categorization worked to maintain hierarchies. Prison abolitionists read him and found tools for critiquing the carceral state. Queer theorists read him and developed his insights about how sexuality became identity. The concept of the Panopticon entered popular consciousness, becoming shorthand for surveillance societies. People who had never read Discipline and Punish knew the image of the prison where inmates monitored themselves. In the age of security cameras and social media, of data collection and algorithmic sorting, Michel's analysis of how power worked through visibility and normalization seemed more relevant than ever. But perhaps his most important legacy was methodological, the practice of genealogy, of asking how things that seem natural and inevitable actually have histories, of showing that what was constructed can be deconstructed and potentially reconstructed differently. He had given people a way to question everything they took for granted, to see power operating in places where it claimed to be absent. To recognize the self they experienced as natural and essential was actually produced through specific practices. And he had lived the questions he asked. His life was not separate from his work, but continuous with it, an ongoing experiment in refusing to be what he had been told to be. From the suicidal student at the École Normale, to the archaeologist of madness, to the anatomist of power, to the practitioner of pleasure, each transformation was both theoretical and existential, thought and life inseparable. In San Francisco, the community he had loved continued to die. By the end of the 1980s, an entire generation of gay men had been decimated. The leather bars he had frequented closed or changed character entirely. The experimental freedom of the 1970s gave way to grief and activism, to ACT UP and memorial quilts, to the long fight to force the government to acknowledge the epidemic and fund research. When effective treatments finally arrived in the mid-1990s, transforming AIDS from a death sentence to a manageable chronic illness, many thought about the friends and lovers lost during the years of governmental neglect. Michel Foucault was one name among thousands, tens of thousands, millions eventually as the epidemic spread globally. His fame meant his death was noted where others were forgotten, but the loss was no more or less tragic than any other life cut short.
His work on biopolitics, on how modern states manage life and death, deciding which populations to foster and which to let die, became a crucial framework for understanding the AIDS epidemic. The government's abandonment of gay men dying of AIDS was not accidental or incidental. It was biopolitics in action, the state exercising its power to let die, calculating that these lives were not worth the investment required to save them. But Michel had also written about resistance, about how power always generates its own opposition, about how people use the very categories created to control them as resources for fighting back. The AIDS activism that emerged in the late 1980s embodied this insight. ACTU UP used civil disobedience and direct action, forcing pharmaceutical companies and government agencies to change their practices. People with AIDS refused to be passive victims, instead becoming experts on their own condition, demanding a voice in research and treatment decisions. This was the kind of resistance Michel had pointed toward in his later work, not liberation in the name of a true self, but the creative use of available resources to contest power, the refusal to be governed in particular ways, the insistence on having a say in how your own life and death would be managed. 20 years after his death, the French government finally acknowledged that Michel Foucault had died of AIDS. The recognition was both important and inadequate. Important because it ended the official silence, the euphemism and erasure. Inadequate because no posthumous acknowledgement could compensate for the stigma and shame that had surrounded his death, for the silence imposed on the circumstances that killed him. His books continued to be read, debated, applied to new contexts. Each generation found new uses for his concepts, new questions his methods could help address.
The specifics of his arguments were sometimes wrong. Historians corrected his account of the Great Confinement, showed that his history of sexuality oversimplified some developments. But the fundamental insights remained powerful, that power and knowledge were inseparable, that what we took as natural truths about ourselves were historical constructions, that we were not doomed to remain the subjects we had been made to be. You could work on yourself, develop practices of the self, create your existence differently. This was not easy or guaranteed to succeed. Power was always there, ready to capture and normalize your resistance, but it was possible, and possibility was what Michel offered, not a program or a solution, but an opening, a way of seeing that made other ways of living imaginable. Now, as we reach the end of this story, perhaps we can rest with what Michel showed us, that the categories we use to understand ourselves, normal and abnormal, healthy and sick, free and constrained, are not natural facts, but historical constructions. That power is not just something that says no, but something that produces reality, shapes subjects, creates the very desires and identities we experience as our truest selves. But also that we are not helpless before power, that understanding its mechanisms gives us tools for resistance, that the same practices that subject us can be turned toward different ends, used to create forms of life that escape what power intended. Michel lived this understanding. He refused to be the person his father wanted, the normal heterosexual his psychiatrists tried to cure him into being, the respectable professor his position required. He created himself through practices, intellectual work and sexual experimentation, writing and pleasure, solitary study and collective action, practices that were never finished, always provisional, always open to revision.
He died young, killed by a disease that power refused to acknowledge because the people it killed were considered disposable. But in his 57 years, he showed that even lives marked as abnormal and pathological could be lived with dignity, intensity, and purpose. That the outsider's position was not just suffering, but also a vantage point, a place from which to see what those on the inside could not. Sleep now, knowing that the questions Michel asked remain alive, waiting for new generations to take them up. That the work of understanding how we became subjects of power continues, because power continues, always adapting, always finding new ways to shape us, but also knowing that resistance continues, that people keep finding ways to refuse what they have been told to be, keep creating lives that power did not plan for. The boy who could not fit became the philosopher who showed that fitting was never the point. The archaeologist of madness and the anatomist of power left behind tools for excavating our own subjection and maps for navigating toward freedom. Not liberation, Michel was too suspicious of that word, but freedom understood as the endless work of refusing to be governed in particular ways, of creating practices that let us live differently. Rest now in the possibility that opens when we stop taking ourselves for granted, when we ask how we became what we are and whether we might become something else. The night is deep, the questions remain, and tomorrow they will be waiting, patient as stone, urgent as breath. Michel Foucault's journey is complete, but the journey he pointed toward continues. We are all subjects of power, yes, but we are also more than that, always becoming, always capable of surprise. That was his gift, not answers, but better questions, not solutions, but clearer sight, not comfort, but the dangerous freedom of knowing that nothing about us is inevitable. Sleep well, the work continues, the possibilities remain. And somewhere in the dark, Michel's ghost is still asking, what else might we be? If this exploration of Michel Foucault's life has accompanied you gently toward rest, consider leaving a like to help others find these stories. Subscribe to continue these journeys through remarkable lives, and tell us in the comments whose story you'd like to hear next. Until then, may your dreams be questioning, and may you wake with the courage to see your own life as something you can work on, shape, and create anew.